I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about a New York Times editorial board article. The title of that article is, "What's America's Winning Hand If Russia Plays the China Card?" Now, Zero Hedge actually ran this article as well, and they said this is not The Onion when they were citing this article. And obviously they're making a play here at the fact that after 2-3 years of Trump is a Putin troll, Trump is a Putin stooge, Trump is a Manchurian candidate, Russia collusion, Russia election meddling, Russia. The New York Times was probably one of the publications in the forefront of pushing that narrative. Now here comes the New York Times editorial board, and they say, well, wait a minute, Trump should, look to get on the good side of Russia because we don't want Russia to join forces with China. I think they're a little late to the game. Alexander, what do you make of this article?
I mean, they're far too late to the game. I mean, this article talks about peeling Russia away from China by somehow improving relations with Russia and agreeing with the Russians on various things. Now, that might have been a plausible strategy 15 years ago, or even 10 years ago. It's long past its sell-by date now. And you can see why if you read the article, because the article itself, first of all, it's, again, incredibly manipulative in its tone. I mean, it doesn't say we really like the Russians or we see any real value in having good relations with the Russians. It treats the Russians as a pawn in a big game of geopolitical chess that the United States is now fighting against its latest enemy, which is China. I mean, Russia is yesterday's enemy. China is today's enemy. So, we patch up with yesterday's enemy to go after today's enemy. I mean, any Russian reading that will immediately realize that they're being used. And also, it contains no recognition that in its relations with Russia, the US ever did anything wrong. So you don't hear anything, you don't read anything there about, the promises not to extend NATO, which were broken, the promises, the breach of the ABM treaty, the US walking away from the ABM treaty, the meddling in Russian domestic politics with the, democracy promotion operations, the endless sanctions, the Magnitsky Act, the coup in Ukraine, all of these things, the attempt to implicate the Russians in poisoning people in Syria. And of course, you don't see any admission there that, any part of the Russia interfered in the 2016 election business, that any of that is wrong. You get instead the New York Times offering some scraps to the Russians on arms control, on one or two other small things, and expecting that the Russians will quickly run away from the Chinese and agree to sit down and be a good dog for the United States so that China can be, isolated again. I mean, no Russian in their senses would ever agree to this. And the article shows why. Now, I'm going to say something else, which is, of course, goes beyond this, which is that Russian and Chinese relations were starting to improve from the 1980s. It has been a long process of convergence between these two countries. It was quite clear some years ago that American pressure on each of them was creating a de facto alliance between them. In 2016, I wrote an article for the Duran, 2016, mind you. I wrote an article for the Duran, which is actually entitled The Russian-Chinese Alliance. The United States and the New York Times has only now woken up to that fact. An alliance like this, set up over such a long period, is not going to be picked apart. The Russians and the Chinese are now committed to this alliance that they have developed between each other. And nothing the United States can do is going to change that.
From the article, Alexander, it says, the two adversaries are growing closer, posing a strategic challenge to the United States. This article is important because it is the editorial board that represents the opinions of the board, its editors, and the publisher. So this is coming straight from the New York Times. Alexander, they are admitting that Russia and China are going to be a formidable adversary to the United States.
Yes.
What makes Russia and China such good strategic partners, such good political partners, economic partners? Why are these two countries coming together? Because you can make the argument that the U.S. pushed them together, but when you're talking about geopolitics, it's not so much, you can't just say, oh, because these guys don't like us, we're going to form an alliance. I think for these two countries, there has to be some sort of synergy that also comes into play. Yeah. So why is this such a nightmare scenario for the United States, Russia, and China?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's the world's biggest country, Russia, coming together with the world's most populous country, which is China. It is the country with the world's biggest industrial base, China, coming together with the world's biggest natural resources base, which is Russia. Both of these countries are tremendous technological powers. You can't build hypersonic missiles as the Russians do, and intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines as the Russians also do, and you cannot build aircraft carriers as the Chinese are now doing, if you do not have tremendous scientific and technological resources. They dominate together Eurasia. They are this huge block of Eurasian states, which are now going to start congregating around these two major Eurasian powers. So they are strategically placed around what you might call the most important continent in the world. And they are both masters of statecraft. Both the Russians and the Chinese are superb at diplomacy, superb at foreign relations, and they have completely compatible and consistent views of the world, so that they can divide and concentrate. They can divide the world and concentrate on different parts of it. So the Chinese can take the lead, for example, in the Korea, in the Pacific. The Russians can take the lead in Europe and the Middle East, and the two complement each other. So it's a marriage between two great powers that are fully compatible with each other, and it is an obvious fit. Now, what makes it so powerful and so dangerous to the United States is that for the first time in American history, it is going to face an alliance whose aggregate resources in terms of population, technology, I know Americans find this difficult to accept, but technology, natural resources, and manufacturing exceed its own. The United States has never faced that position before. During the Cold War, even in the 1950s, when the Soviet Union and China were nominal allies, the United States dwarfed them economically. It doesn't do so now. And the gap between the Eurasian powers and the United States is growing in the Eurasian powers' favor. So this is a complete transformation in the geopolitical world. And it's why you see the New York Times getting concerned about it. You see the Economist in Britain now getting concerned about it. You see articles appearing all sorts of places. You see think tanks worrying about it and trying to find a way of severing this alliance. It's unseverable. It's unbreakable. The game of playing Russia off against China, well, that particular train has left the station and there's no going back.
Yeah, especially after what they did to Serbia, after Iraq, after Libya.
Exactly.
After this 3 years of Russiagate, after Ukraine and the coup there, after Taiwan, after all these things that have been going on over the last 10 to 15 years,
Yes.
I think it's inconceivable to see Russia or China moving back into the U.S. orbit. Alexander,
No.
in your view, going back the last 10, 20 years, what do you think were the key points, the key moments in time where both Russia and China said, you know what, maybe we should, do some business together, because these
Right.
guys in the West, they're out to destroy us, they're out to break us apart?
Right. I think that the Russians and the Chinese, as I said, starting from the 1980s, had already decided that it was in their mutual interest to put the quarrels of the 1960s behind them and to come together and become friends again, because they share this enormous border, and it was a very big drain on each of their resources to maintain vast armies against each other there. So there would have been, irrespective of anything the United States did, there would have been an improvement in relations between the Chinese and the Russians. But what are the major signposts? The first was a decision in 1982, it goes back that far, between the Soviets and the Chinese to start negotiations about improving relations. And it was flagged up, by the way, by a completely forgotten speech that Leonid Brezhnev, I remember, making in Tashkent just a few weeks before he died. Then the next step was when Mikhail Gorbachev went to China in 1989 and refused to impose sanctions on China after the Tiananmen disturbances. So that, told the Chinese that there was improvement in relations. The third point was that the Chinese at that point, during the Tiananmen disturbances, and seeing the way the United States was supporting the protesters in Beijing and perhaps had a role in inciting those protests, they realized that the United States was fundamentally hostile to the political system as it existed in China. And then two critical events happened, one after the other. One was in 1998, when the United States launched Operation Desert Fox, which was a bombing campaign against Iraq, which both the Russians and the Chinese opposed. And that was the first moment that the Russians and the Chinese worked together diplomatically on the Security Council to oppose an American action. I remember it well. And then the second moment was the Yugoslav war, which you correctly mentioned, which shocked both the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese had very close relations with Yugoslavia, and of course their embassy in Belgrade was bombed during that war. And of course many people forget that. And of course the Russians were also deeply shocked by that attack on a fellow Slav Orthodox country that had always been a friend of Russia. So at that point, I think that the Russians and the Chinese started to talk together to each other in earnest. And they started to say, after these events, and when Putin became president, especially after Putin became president, they started to work together and to start matching up and saying to each other, well, this is the moment when we've got to start coordinating our foreign policy positions. But I think for the Russians, the key events that completely changed their orientation, because Putin became president looking for a good relationship with the United States. Two events which really concerned him. One was the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which I know that he was extremely concerned about and was deeply angered about. And that led directly to the 2007 Munich Security Conference speech, in which he spoke about the United States pursuing a unipolar policy and how that was wrong. And by that time, the Chinese were also becoming increasingly concerned about US pressure on the South China Sea with Taiwan. And it was around 2007 that the thing began to gain momentum. and we began to see the pieces of an alliance coming together. And then last but not least, Xi Jinping comes along with his great One Belt, One Road plan. And that's the moment when we start to see the huge thrust towards economic integration starting to happen. And then in 2014, and note the year, because that's the year when relations between the US and Russia go catastrophically wrong, with the Ukraine crisis, with the sanctions being rolled out against Russia. That's the year when the Russians commit to building gas and oil pipelines to China. And I can remember commentators at that time in the West saying confidently that those pipelines would not be built because they made no economic sense. They have been built. They're coming on stream at the end of this year, and they are the basis of a massive economic relationship. And now we see that this relationship has expanded into a multi-vector relationship, with the Russians and the Chinese collaborating now in aerospace. They're working together to basically merge their civilian aircraft industries, working together on their space programs. Russia emerging as potentially, in fact, almost certainly before very long, China's major food producer, and the Russians importing or working with the Chinese on 5G and importing Chinese know-how to develop their e-commerce, which of course the Russians have fallen behind on. So we see this massive integration going on between these two economies, which is now happening at every level, and with the Russians and the Chinese increasingly trading in each other's current currencies and no longer using the dollar. So we've gone from a position of tentative friendship in the 80s, diplomatic engagement in the 90s, foreign policy cooperation in the 2000s, into a full spectrum multi-vector alliance in now, which is what we have now.
Okay, looking at it from the U.S. perspective, and let's just start from, say, the Bush presidency, and working our way up to Trump. There were moments in time where it seemed that the U.S. understood the dangers of a Russia-Chinese synergy. And I remember there's times where George Bush, he famously said, I can look into Putin's soul. I look into his eyes and I see his soul. And he tried to create the illusion, or maybe he really did have a good relationship with Putin, but he would always talk about, how he understands Putin. So he tried to create that illusion. That was Bush. And then you had Obama and Hillary Clinton, the famous reset, Lavrov and the reset button. And then you work your way up to Trump. And Trump, who I think genuinely did want a good relation with Putin and with Xi, and does want a good relation with Putin and with Xi. So looking back on these three presidencies, Bush, Obama, and now Trump, where do you think the wheels came off in the last, 15, 20 years? Even though I think there really were, if we're looking at it from an honest perspective, there were attempts, both by the Bush administration and the Obama administration, to try and get a handle, at least with Russia, so as to prevent this alliance from solidifying.
Where did it come from? I think we are going to be, in decades' time, people are going to be writing histories about this, because it's the big question of our present age. How did the United States mishandle its relations with both China and Russia so badly that an alliance between Russia and China, which was clearly a possibility, was actually brought about, when it could have been prevented?
Accelerated.
Accelerated, exactly. And I predict that there will be, in the future, huge recriminations about this. And I get to say straightforwardly, it came as a result of this extraordinary doctrine that took hold in the 1990s of American exceptionalism, this idea that the United States had somehow won the Cold War, that it was the indisputable master of the international system with this gigantic economy that dwarfed everyone else's, that it was now the not just the superpower but the hyperpower, and it meant that it was impossible psychologically for the United States to compromise with countries like China and Russia, which the US always axiomatically assumed would in the end have to bend before America's will. And that meant that the United States never was able to negotiate with the Chinese or the Russians on anything remotely like equal terms. Now, that was one side of it, but I'm afraid there's also another side of it, which is that in terms of Russia, the hardline neocons always in the end won out. And they didn't want a relationship with Russia. What they wanted, what they believed they could get, was a kind of breakup of Russia and its transformation into a kind of vassal state, such as it almost became in the 1990s. So you see all these Brzezinski type strategies of, planting missiles around Russia, detaching all the former Soviet republics from Russia, the attempts to micromanage Russian domestic politics by trying to sort of set up protest groups and NGOs and liberal oppositions in Russia. They're still playing this game. I mean, today when we're speaking, there has been an attempt again to organize a demonstration in Moscow, Navalny, which attracted all of a few thousand people. But I mean, the point is, they still haven't given up on this. They can't give up on this because there is enormous intellectual and bureaucratic inertia behind it, and vast amounts of money have been invested in it, and all sorts of people have bought into it. And you have, with the arms industries, people who have a huge stake in it. So in the end, people like Obama, who sort of wanted a better relationship with Russia, but it's a very manipulative approach to it. People like George W. Bush, who actually I think was more sincere about it. And of course, people like Donald Trump, who I think was completely as sincere about it, in the end, have never been able to prevail. And instead, what you see is a constant deterioration of relations between the Russians and the US, which has ended up creating this nightmare scenario of the alliance between China and Russia.
Yeah, the neocons and the neoliberals always would win out in the end.
They always win out.
Always win out, and they'd always sabotage any constructive partnerships and cooperations between the U.S. and Russia, and the U.S. and China on a different level. I mean, you can say, okay, they cooperated from an economic sense. Yes. Very, very deeply. But there were other ways that the U.S. could have approached this Eurasian force that was rising.
If it had operated a proper realist foreign policy, I mean, as I say, a friendship between China and Russia was, in my opinion, inevitable. An alliance was not. And to the extent that the United States has an interest in preventing that alliance from happening, because such an alliance, to be very clear, is inevitably an anti-American alliance, the United States had options and possibilities to prevent it happening. But the neoliberals and the neocons are disastrous at everything except one thing. They lose all their wars except the ones in Washington, which they always win.
And they always get promoted.
And they always get promoted. And so you have all these awful people like, Boot and Crystal and all the rest. They're always there. Bolton. They're always the talking heads. Bolton. They're always there. They always get promoted. They always take senior positions. And invariably, whatever they try in foreign policy fails. but in bureaucratic terms, they succeed. And that's been the disaster. And that will have to be something that, as I say, future generations of historians are going to spend a huge amount of time analyzing and trying to explain.
And another thing that I think people can analyze, which you really made a good point by bringing it up, the history of it all is, how the beginning of the end, and we've brought it up in a lot of videos when we've talked about Serbia and what happened in Yugoslavia,
yes,
the breakup of Yugoslavia, that the beginning of the end for this Western hegemon and this Western empire
yes,
was Yugoslavia and
yes,
Serbia. And,
yes,
we're now 20 years removed from it,
yes,
20 years plus removed. But looking back on it, when you mentioned the bombing of the Chinese embassy and Russia's reaction to what they did to Serbia, you look back on it now and you start to understand that those events back then, that was the seed that brought about where we are in the world today.
It was, because it was an act of aggression against a European country, a founder member of the non-aligned movement, a friend of Russia and a friend of China, an attack on the Chinese embassy, a violation of international law because it was carried out without the consent of the Security Council, and it was an aggressive war waged by NATO. After that moment, any claim that NATO is purely a defensive alliance simply carries no credibility, because it has already waged an offensive war. So that was a moment which crystallized opinion, both in Beijing and Moscow, and inexorably it has led to the position we now have. Now, it could have been stopped. As I said, there were options, but that would have required a radical shift in US foreign policy, which has never happened.
Yeah, and that was in essence the expression of American exceptionalism, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
A very aggressive and disgusting way that it was done, but it was an expression of, American exceptionalism, of Bill Clinton thumbing his nose at the world,
yes,
bombing Serbia,
yes,
bombing Belgrade, distracting attention away from BJ's in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Which it was. It was such a disgusting, such a
absolutely
blatant act of aggression and a lack of morals and ethics and respect for international law and international community. But it led, looking back at it now, led to where we are today. And sometimes these things take time to manifest the consequences of these actions, but here we are.
Indeed, and it was the time, it was around the Yugoslav war that we first heard the sort of classic expression of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, by the way, is a phrase that can be used in many different ways, but American exceptionalism used to justify America's supposed immunity from international law. And it was Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, and she said, that the United States is this exceptional country. It sees further. It is the indispensable country that has the right and the duty to do things which other countries cannot do. And it was also at this time, and it was actually done by Tony Blair. I will never forget this, in a speech which he did in the United States, but he was talking not just for Britain, he was talking for the United States, also articulating this doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which was essentially a legitimization of regime change and trying to rewrite international law in order to give the access of the United States and its friends, the so-called international community as he defined it, the right to intervene in other countries and to overthrow their governments. And people, as I said, in Moscow and Beijing, they saw all that, they heard all of that, and they said, so far, but no further, from this point on, we are not prepared to allow ourselves to fall victim to this thing. And that inevitably meant that as the Russians and the Chinese improved their relations with each other and got to talk to each other, they found that they shared the similar concerns about the way the United States was going, and eventually that has evolved into the alliance that we now have. But 1999, that war in Yugoslavia, that was the key turning point.
Yeah, and I remember it was Samantha Power that wrote a book on humanitarian wars. I mean, there's
Yes.
two words for you: humanitarian wars, humanitarian intervention.
Yes.
And where did Samantha Power end up? She ended up as the U.S. ambassador at the UN under Obama. And Obama
Indeed.
took that humanitarian war concept to heart. I mean, he really
Absolutely.
took it to heart.
Well, absolutely.
And he started a lot of wars based on humanitarian.
Absolutely. Destroyed Libya and destroyed Syria in the process. And of course, that's another point to say. I mean, Libya was the point where I think the Chinese and the Russians both said, and by this point, they were communicating to each other. They were saying, with Libya, that's the last one. That's the last one where the US will be able to do it, and we won't be there to resist it. So when Syria came along, the Russians went in, and the Chinese backed them. And now we see the Russians in Venezuela. We see the Russians working with Iran. We see the Chinese standing up for North Korea. And from that moment on, as I said, the US found once again that it was no longer able to roam around the world, change governments as it pleased, intervened as it liked. And there's nothing that people in the New York Times editorial board, or they're in the State Department, or in the Economist newspaper can do to change it.
There you go. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we push out a new video. Please donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. It really helps out this channel a whole lot. And you can get an audio copy of this video. Follow us on iTunes and on Soundcloud. And don't forget, go to the Duran shop, pick up t-shirts, hats, mugs. And also on the Duran shop, we have 2 ebooks on Russiagate, where if you buy the 2, you get a very special price. And Alexander Mercouris wrote forwards to both of those ebooks. So Alexander, you want to talk about shirts? You want to talk about ebooks? You want to talk about ebooks and shirts? You want to talk about wearing shirts while you're reading your ebook?
Indeed. How else could I write books like that without wearing shirts like this and getting the inspiration from drinking from mugs like this? But the point about those 2 books is that they are an attempt to unpack the mythology of Russiagate by setting out the true events that happened. One of the books looks at how the whole thing evolved, what was essentially a conspiracy to make Hillary Clinton president, and then when that failed, to delegitimize Donald Trump. And in that book, both in the preface and in the videos of which we provide transcripts, we explain how that happened. That sequence of events going all the way back to 2015, which eventually culminated in the gigantic hoax of Russiagate. And the second book is about how the Mueller investigation, which was supposed to look into this, how it got completely rogue, and how he took this white knight, because that's what he was, riding to the rescue, Bill Barr, the new Attorney General of the United States, a real Attorney General, a real lawyer, finally to come along, say, let's put a stop to all this nonsense, and by doing that, effectively saving the US Republic. Now, this is complicated and difficult stuff. In order to sustain myself while writing those kind of prefaces, and whilst we do these kind of videos, well, we drink from cups like this. And what better symbol of Chinese-Russian friendship, as we've been discussing on this video, could we have than a mug, perfect, beautiful porcelain mug with the Russian state symbol as used by Putin. And in it, I'm drinking a great Chinese tea, Iron Goddess of Mercy tea, picked by monkeys apparently from a high cliff. That's what Selfridges claims, whom I bought it from. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But anyway, an absolutely great oolong tea, drunk from an amazing tea with the Russian state symbol. And of course, you can see that we have our own double-headed eagle there, pointing to the east and the west. That's the Duran double-headed eagle. This is the current Russian one, as used by Putin, appears on all his tableware. But this is our eagle on our shirt. It's a fantastic shirt, 100% cotton, beautifully dyed. My wife loves these shirts. Well, Alex just heard it before we started this program from my wife, how much she loves these shirts. And so she should, because it's 100% cotton. It's beautifully dyed. It's great to wear. I've worn this shirt to a trip to my lawyers. Everybody else is looking at me admiringly. It's comfortable. It's cool in hot weather. It's fantastic in all seasons. Help yourself. Buy these shirts. Buy these mugs. Read our books. Learn. Expand your understanding and help the Duran.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Well said. Until next time, everybody, take care.